In 1988, a black family of 5 disappeared on the way to a lakeside cabin. Decades later, a rusted vault door is found at the bottom of the drained lake, its handle chained shut from the outside. The year was 2023. Lake Holloway, once a shimmering expanse of blue, was now a vast, cracked basin of dried mud under the relentless summer sun. A historic drought had shrunk it to a ghost of its former self, revealing secrets swallowed by water decades ago. And this secret, this thing, was the most terrible of all. It jutted from the caked earth near what would have been the old shoreline, a monstrous, algae-stained metal box. A vault. Who puts a vault at the bottom of a lake? And why chain it from the outside? The chain itself was thick, links fused by rust, wrapped tight around the heavy wheel handle, a crude padlock holding it fast. It looked like something from a nightmare. Old Man Hemlock, who'd lived by the lake his entire 80 years, was the one who spotted it first. He'd been walking the newly exposed lakebed, a habit born of curiosity and a lifetime of watching the water levels rise and fall. But never like this. He'd seen old tires, sunken boats, lost fishing gear. He'd never seen anything that made the hairs on his arms stand up, until now. He'd called the sheriff's department, his voice thin and shaky, said it looked like a tomb. Deputy Miles Corbin was the first to arrive. Young, barely 5 years on the force, he felt a chill despite the blistering heat. The vault wasn't just old, it felt ancient, malevolent. He ran a gloved hand over the pitted surface. Then he saw them, tiny, discolored scraps of fabric, caught tight in the hinges of the massive door, as if something soft had been trapped when it was slammed shut. Blues and yellows, faded, but the pattern, a small floral print, was still discernible on one piece. Another was a sturdy denim blue. Why did that feel important? What was tugging at the edge of his memory? He radioed back, his voice tighter than he intended. This wasn't just an abandoned safe. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the worries of his county, arrived an hour later. He was older, had seen more than his share of strange things. But this was different. He crouched, his knees cracking, and peered at the fabric scraps. He remembered the posters. God, he remembered the posters. Every telephone pole, every shop window, for miles around. Back in 1988. The Wright family, Arthur and Louise, and their 3 children, 10-year-old Marcus, 8-year-old Clara, and little 5-year-old Rosie, vanished. One Friday afternoon, they'd packed their old station wagon, headed for a rented cabin on the far side of Lake Holloway. They never arrived. No car, no note, no trace, just gone. The floral print, it was Rosie's favorite dress, her mother had told the papers, her voice breaking. The denim, Marcus always wore jeans. Brody felt a cold sickness rise in his throat. 35 years. 35 years they'd been a local ghost story, a cautionary tale. And now this. He looked at the chain, the heavy padlock. Chained from the outside, the implication was suffocating. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Someone had put them in there. Or something. But what? People? Were they looking at a family tomb, sealed against their will? The thought was almost too horrific to hold. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping the desolate, empty lakebed. The silence was immense, broken only by the hum of insects and the distant cry of a hawk. He had to know. They all had to know. What was inside that rusted metal box? The dread was a physical weight, pressing down on him, on all of them. He gave the order, "Get cutters. Get that door open." But as he said it, he wondered if they were truly prepared for what lay beyond that chained handle. Some doors, he thought, were maybe better left unopened. But this one, had waited long enough. The family deserved that much. The truth, no matter how terrible. The news spread like wildfire through the small towns bordering the lake. The Wright family. After all this time, whispers turned into anxious murmurs. People gathered at the police cordon, their faces grim, hopeful, terrified. They remembered the picnics, the school plays, Arthur's easy laugh, Louise's kind smile. The children, bright sparks snuffed out too soon. Had they been here all along? So close? The thought of them trapped in the dark under the water, it was unbearable. The local news crews arrived, then the regional ones. The vault became a focal point, a dark star drawing all eyes. It sat there, impassive, indifferent to the turmoil it had caused, holding its secrets tight. The sun beat down, baking the mud, and the team prepared to breach it. Every person there felt it, a profound sense of approaching revelation, and an equally profound fear of what that revelation might be. The fabric scraps, those tiny, fragile flags of memory, fluttered slightly in the hot, dry breeze, a silent, heartbreaking testament. What had happened to Rosie's dress, to Marcus's jeans? What horrors had those clothes witnessed before being torn away and trapped in the metal jaws of the vault door? The questions hung heavy in the air, as thick and oppressive as the summer heat. The weight was agonizing. The heavy-duty bolt cutters arrived with a specialized team. The chain was thick, hardened steel, fused by decades of underwater corrosion. Sparks flew as the cutter bit into the metal, the screeching sound echoing across the barren lakebed, a sound that seemed to slice through time itself. Each snap of a link was like a gunshot in the heavy silence. People held their breath. Sheriff Brody stood closest, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the padlock. It, too, resisted, a final guardian of the vault's secrets. They had to use a grinder on that, the acrid smell of burning metal filling the air. Finally, with a last, reluctant groan, the chain fell away. The handle, a large, rusted wheel, was now free, but the door itself was still sealed tight, pressed into its frame by time and immense pressure. Two men put their shoulders to it, grunting with effort. Nothing. They brought in a hydraulic spreader, a tool usually reserved for car wrecks. The machine whined. Metal shrieked against metal. Then, with a sudden sucking sound, the seal broke. A puff of stale, ancient air, cold and damp, escaped, carrying with it a smell that made several onlookers gag and turn away. It was the smell of long enclosed spaces, of decay, of something else, something indescribably sorrowful. The door, groaning like a creature in pain, began to inch open. What waited inside? What story was about to unfold from that cold, dark mouth? Inside, it wasn't what they expected. Not immediately. No bodies, no skeletal remains met their initial fearful gaze. Instead, the beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness to reveal things, objects, piled, scattered, preserved in the cool, still air of the sealed chamber. It was like peering into a forgotten room, a time capsule. There were suitcases, old-fashioned hard-shell types, blankets, folded neatly on one side, a stack of books, their covers faded, and children's toys. A worn teddy bear with one button eye missing, a bright red toy truck, its paint chipped, a doll with yarn hair, lying face down. Items from a life interrupted, packed, yes, as if for a journey, but there was an oddness to the collection, a sense of curated desperation. Why these specific things? The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood, but not quite. Detective Harding, A younger officer who'd grown up hearing the legend of the Wright family stepped forward, his flashlight beam dancing across the contents. He was careful not to disturb anything yet. Every item was a potential clue, a piece of a puzzle 35 years in the making. He saw a thermos, a picnic basket, things you'd take on a cabin trip, but then other items. A toolbox, heavy, industrial, rolls of duct tape, a battery-operated lantern, its casing cracked, and stacks of canned food, labels mostly illegible from dampness, but clearly a substantial supply. Enough for weeks, maybe longer. Why would a family going to a rented cabin for a weekend need so much? Who packed this? And why was it all sealed in a vault at the bottom of a lake? The questions multiplied with every passing second. Sheriff Brody watched, his face a mask. He recognized the teddy bear. He'd seen a photo of Rosie Wright clutching it, a shy smile on her face. A wave of profound sadness washed over him. This was real. This was their prison. Harding's light fell on something tucked into a corner, almost hidden behind a stack of waterlogged board games. It was a spiral-bound notebook, its cover warped and stained. And beside it, a collection of stubby pencils, the kind used by children. He reached for it carefully, his gloved fingers gentle. The paper was fragile, but the writing, in a surprisingly neat hand, was still visible. He opened it to the first page. The date at the top, written in a child's careful cursive, sent a fresh shockwave through him. June 14th, 1988. 3 days after the Wright family had officially disappeared. What did this mean? They were alive. In here? After everyone thought they were gone? He flipped a page, then another. More entries, dates, observations, a chronicle. A voice from the darkness. The vault wasn't just a container of belongings, it was a witness. It held a timeline. And as Harding scanned the first few lines, a chilling realization began to dawn. This wasn't just about a disappearance. This was about captivity. Long, terrifying captivity. His gaze lifted, met Brody's. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. The air was thick with the unspoken. The real horror, they sensed, was only just beginning to reveal itself. At the bottom of the notebook, almost as an afterthought, was a small, crudely drawn picture of a sun, with the words, Day 1, written underneath. Day 1 of what? How many days had there been? The discovery of the journal electrified the small team aloud near the vault. This was it. The voice they had longed for, the story they had feared. Harding, with Brody looking over his shoulder, began to read aloud, his voice low and steady, though his hands trembled slightly. The first entry was simple, matter-of-fact, written in what looked like the mother, Louise Wright's, handwriting. June 14th, 1988. He brought us here. Said it was safer. The storm is bad outside, he told us. We have to wait it out. The children are scared, but Arthur is trying to be brave for them. A storm? There had been no major storm reported that weekend in June, 1988. A few scattered showers. Nothing more. Who was he? And why did they believe him? The entry continued, describing the inside of the vault, the metallic smell, the dim light from the single lantern they had. Louise wrote about rationing the snacks they'd packed for the cabin. She mentioned Marcus trying to teach Clara a new card game, and Rosie crying for her own bed. Small human details that made the situation even more chilling. They thought this was temporary. A strange, uncomfortable detour. As Harding read on, the entries, penned mostly by Louise, but with occasional, childlike scrawls from Marcus, painted a grim picture. June 15th. No sign of him. The lantern is getting weak. Arthur tried the door. It's locked. He says the handle outside must have jammed. He doesn't want us to worry. Jammed or chained? Did Arthur know? Was he trying to protect his family from an even more terrifying truth? The scraps of fabric caught in the door hinges suddenly took on a new, horrifying meaning. Had one of the children, perhaps Rosie in her floral dress or Marcus in his jeans, been near the door when it was slammed shut and chained? Or had they tried to signal, to push something out through a tiny crack? A desperate plea. The thought was sickening. The journal mentioned the dwindling food supplies they'd brought for the cabin. June 17th. Rosie asked when we can go to the lake. I told her soon. So very soon. There was a forced cheerfulness in Louise's words that was heartbreaking. She was trying to maintain normalcy in an increasingly abnormal, terrifying situation. Then, a new section began, dated a week later. June 21st. He came back. More food. More water. He didn't open the door all the way, just enough to pass things in. He said the danger outside was still too great. What danger? He won't say. His face was hidden in shadow. This he, their captor. He was controlling them, feeding them just enough information to keep them compliant, terrified. The journal chronicled these brief, disturbing interactions. He never stayed long, never showed his face clearly, always spoke of a vague, persistent threat outside, a threat that kept them prisoners. The entries detailed the parents' efforts to keep the children occupied. They told stories, sang songs, drew pictures on the blank pages of the notebook with the stubby pencils. Little Rosie drew a picture of their house, with a smiling sun above it. Marcus listed his favorite baseball players. Small acts of defiance against the crushing darkness. But the underlying fear was always there, a cold current beneath the surface of Louise's careful prose. July 5th. It's been weeks. The air is getting stale. Clara has a cough. He says he's working on a better place for us. A safe place. When? The hope in that last word was almost palpable, yet utterly devastating to read. Knowing what they knew now, this vault was the place. There was no better place coming. The timeline was stretching, days turning into weeks. How long could they have survived in such conditions? How long did their hope last before it curdled into despair? The last entry Harding read from that initial scan was dated July 10th, nearly a month after they disappeared, and the tone had shifted. The forced optimism was gone, replaced by a quiet, chilling desperation. He hasn't come in 3 days. The last of the canned food is almost gone. The lantern died. We are in the dark. The world outside the vault in 1988 had moved on, albeit with a lingering sorrow. The initial search for the right family had been intense. Sheriff Miller, Brody's predecessor, a man now stooped with age and living in a nursing home a county over, had led it himself. He'd thrown every resource he had at it. They'd scoured the roads, the woods, dragged parts of Lake Holloway, interviewed everyone who had seen the rites that fateful Friday. Arthur had picked up the kids from school. Louise had left work early. They'd stopped for gas and snacks at a local store. The clerk remembered them, happy, excited about their weekend away. Then, nothing. Their old station wagon, a distinctive pale green, had simply vanished along with them. Theories abounded. Had Arthur, rumored to have some minor gambling debts, decided to run? Unlikely, everyone said. He adored his family. An accident? But where was the wreckage? The lake was the obvious suspect, but divers found nothing. Sonar turned up no car-shaped anomalies in the sections they could reach. Foul play was suspected, of course. But with no bodies, no ransom demand, no viable suspects, the case grew cold with heartbreaking speed. The community had mourned, vigils were held. The children's empty desks at school were a daily, painful reminder. Louise's colleagues at the library where she worked kept her photo on display for years. Arthur was a well-liked mechanic. His garage felt his absence keenly. They were a good family, people said. A kind family. How could something like this happen? As months turned into years, the posters faded and were eventually taken down. The Wright family became a local tragedy, a story whispered from one generation to the next. The cabin they were supposedly heading to was on the North Shore, a remote area, heavily wooded. The access road was rough. Had they taken a wrong turn? Gotten stuck? Been targeted by someone opportunistic? Sheriff Miller had explored every angle. He'd even considered the lake itself, the possibility of the car going in, but the shoreline near the road was shallow for a long way out. For a car to vanish without a trace there, it would have had to go in deep, far from any logical entry point. And the vault? No one had ever reported a vault being installed or lost in the lake. Lake Holloway itself had been expanded in the early 70s, its water levels raised to create a larger reservoir. The area where the vault was found, near the old shoreline, would have been dry land back in, say, the 60s. But by 1988, it was definitely underwater, though perhaps not as deep as the main body of the lake. Had it been there since before the lake was expanded, a forgotten relic? Or was it placed there, deliberately, around the time of the disappearance? To install something so large, so heavy, would have required significant effort, equipment, and secrecy. How could it have gone unnoticed? Unless it was done by someone who knew the area intimately, someone who knew the lake's hidden contours, its planned expansions. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through Sheriff Brody. He remembered old Miller talking about a few odd reports around that time. Distant sounds of machinery at night, dismissed as local farmers or construction on the far side of the county. Had they missed something vital? A clue hiding in plain sight, dismissed as irrelevant? The original investigation files were probably still packed away in the county archives, gathering dust. It was time, Brody realized, to pull them out, to look at everything again through the grim lens of this terrible discovery. What if one of those dismissed reports, one of those dead ends, held the key? Back in the dim, oppressive space of the vault, the air hung thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. The journal entries, illuminated by Harding's wavering flashlight, grew more desperate. July 15th, 1988. He came. Finally. More water. Not much food. Said things were complicated. He sounded different. Angry. Tired. Rosie is coughing all the time now. It's so damp in here. So cold even when it's hot outside. Louise's handwriting was becoming less steady, the lines wavering. There were smudges, as if tears had fallen on the page. The entries detailed the growing weakness of the children. Clara, once vibrant, was listless. Marcus, trying to be the man of the family in Arthur's increasing silence, wrote a short, heartbreaking entry. Dad doesn't talk much anymore. He just sits and stares at the door. I try to make Mom laugh. It's hard. The simple, childlike honesty was a punch to the gut. What horrors were unfolding in that sealed metal box? What was Arthur witnessing, or fearing, that rendered him silent? The journal described their attempts to make the vault more livable, using the blankets to create softer sleeping areas, rationing the pitiful supplies. But the sheer hopelessness of their situation was becoming undeniable. August honest. So long. It feels like we've been here forever. The food he brings now, it's barely enough. Sometimes it's just stale bread. Water tastes funny. Arthur says, don't drink too much. He tried the door again. Scraped his hands raw. It won't budge. He shouted until his voice gave out. No one heard. The image of Arthur Wright, a proud, capable man, reduced to screaming in a soundproof metal tomb, was devastating. There was evidence of these attempts too. Scratches marred the interior of the heavy steel door, deep gouges around the locking mechanism, as if someone had tried to pry it open with a piece of metal, perhaps from the toolbox. A bent crowbar lay nearby. Its tip snapped. The frustration, the sheer primal terror of being trapped, was palpable in the silent evidence. Then, a specific, chilling entry. August 10th. Rosie is very sick, burning with fever. She keeps asking for Grandma. Louise is singing to her, holding her. Arthur did something. He used the last of the batteries for the lantern just for a few minutes. He said we needed to see. He'd been working on something. He'd managed to pry open a tiny corner of the ventilation slit near the ceiling. Just a crack. He lifted Rosie up, said, "Look, baby stars." Remember the stars. Brody had to turn away for a moment, his eyes stinging. The thought of that father, in that hell, trying to give his dying child one last glimpse of imagined beauty, it was almost too much to bear. The ventilation slit was small, barely visible from the outside, covered by a rusted grate. Had that tiny crack been their only connection to the world? A world that had no idea they were there, suffering, dying. The journal didn't explicitly state that Rosie passed, but the entries that followed were shrouded in an unbearable grief. Louise's handwriting became almost illegible. References to Rosie became past tense. She's not coughing anymore. The stark simplicity of it was a knife to the heart. The focus of the journal shifted subtly. It became less about hope for rescue and more about sheer survival and a dawning, terrifying understanding of their captor. August 20th. He knows. He knows we are getting weaker. He watches us, I think. Sometimes I feel eyes on us, even when he's not here. The food is always just enough to keep us alive, but no more. Why is he doing this? Why us? There was no answer in the cramped, damp pages, only questions. And then, a revelation, scribbled in haste, as if Louise feared she wouldn't have time to write it down. September 20th. Arthur remembered something. The man. The voice. He said it sounds like Mr. Henderson, from the church, the quiet one. Always helping. Always there. But why? Henderson? It can't be. He was always so kind to the children. Mr. Henderson. A name. A possible identity for he. Was this the break they needed? Or a delusion born of desperation and confinement? The entry ended abruptly, the pencil trailing off the page. It was the last entry in Louise Wright's hand. The final pages of the notebook contained only a few more childish drawings, stick figures under a dark, scribbled sky, and then nothing. Silence. What happened after September 2nd? What horrors did those final, unrecorded days, or weeks, or months hold? The vault had given them a voice, but now that voice had fallen silent, leaving them with an even more profound and disturbing mystery. The name, Henderson, hung in the air like a poisonous dust mote. Sheriff Brody felt a jolt. Henderson. He vaguely remembered a Thomas Henderson, a quiet, solitary man who had been a caretaker at one of the local churches back in the 80s. He'd left town a few years after the Wrights disappeared, moved away, people said, for health reasons. No one had ever connected him to the family's vanishing. Why would they? He was a background figure, unassuming, almost invisible. Could Louise Wright, in her desperate state, have correctly identified her family's tormentor? Or was it a guess, a desperate grasp for an explanation in an inexplicable situation? Brody dispatched Deputy Corbin to the county archives with a new urgency. Find everything on Thomas Henderson, and cross-reference it with any information about the Wright family, no matter how trivial. Meanwhile, Harding continued to meticulously process the contents of the vault. Each item was photographed, bagged, and labeled. The children's toys, the worn blankets, the pitiful remnants of food containers. Each piece told a silent story of suffering and resilience. The investigators began to focus on the vault itself. It wasn't a standard bank vault. It was more industrial, like something that might be used for secure document storage, or perhaps even a custom-built panic room, though a crudely made one. There were no manufacturer's marks visible on the interior. Who could have acquired such a thing? And how was it transported and installed at the lake's edge, presumably in secret? This wasn't a one-man job, not without serious equipment. Had Henderson, if it was him, had accomplices, or had he been incredibly resourceful and patient? The questions led back to the land. The area where the vault was found, before the lake's expansion, had been mostly undeveloped woodland, some of it owned by old farming families, some by timber companies. Had Henderson worked for one of them? Had access to equipment? Knowledge of the terrain? While Corbin dug through dusty records, Brody decided to pay a visit to Sheriff Miller. The old man was frail, his memory a patchwork of clarity and fog, but his eyes lit up with a fierce intelligence when Brody mentioned the Wright case and the vault. "Henderson?" Miller rasped, his voice thin. "Thomas Henderson. I remember him. Kept to himself, helped out at the church. Always seemed harmless." He paused, a distant look in his eyes. There was something after the Wrights went missing. Henderson offered to organize a search party for the deep woods on the North Shore. Said he knew those woods like the back of his hand. Seemed very keen. We appreciated the help. He led a team for days. Found nothing, of course. Brody felt a chill. Henderson, leading a search party, knowing all along where the family was? It was diabolical. Misdirection of the highest order. "Did he ever seem off?" Brody asked. Miller frowned, thinking, "Only once." Someone mentioned dragging the lake again, a more thorough search further out. Henderson got agitated. Said it was a waste of resources, that they were long gone, probably left the state. He was very insistent. Too insistent, maybe. Looking back. So much of this case was about looking back, reinterpreting old signs. Corbin called from the archives, his voice tight with excitement. He'd found something. Thomas Henderson had worked, briefly, in the mid-70s, for a construction company that had been involved in the Lake Holloway expansion project. He would have had access to site plans, geological surveys. He would have known exactly where the old shoreline was, and how the water levels would change. And more. The company had reported a large reinforced storage container, essentially a custom-built vault, as lost or stolen from a work site near the lake around that same time. It was deemed too expensive to recover from the rough terrain where it was supposedly lost. The report had been filed and forgotten, until now. The pieces were falling into place, forming a horrifying picture. Henderson didn't just stumble upon a vault. He likely stole it, or knew where it was. He had the means, the knowledge, and, it seemed, a deeply twisted motive that was yet to be fully understood. Why the Wrights? Had there been some connection, some perceived slight, some dark obsession? The vault's contents hinted at a captor who wanted to control, to possess, but not necessarily to kill quickly. It was a slow, torturous imprisonment. The final damning piece of information Corbin relayed was Henderson's current whereabouts. He was alive. 91 years old, living in a quiet retirement community, 2 states over. The discovery that Thomas Henderson was still alive, and the strong circumstantial evidence linking him to the vault and the Wright family's disappearance, sent a ripple of grim determination through the investigation. Sheriff Brody knew this was their one chance. Henderson was old, perhaps frail, but his mind might still hold the answers, the final pieces of this horrifying puzzle. What was his motive? And, the most pressing, agonizing question that the journal didn't answer, what happened to the bodies? The vault contained their belongings, their last messages, their fear, but not them. Had they perished in the vault and Henderson had later removed them? Or had he, as Louise had written he'd promised, moved them to a better place, a place perhaps even more sinister? The thought was unbearable. The team pored over the last entries in the journal, searching for any clue. Louise's final coherent entry mentioned Arthur remembering Henderson's voice. The childish drawings that followed, did they mean anything? One drawing showed stick figures, not inside a box, but standing beside a dark, looming shape that could have been a tree, or perhaps a vehicle. Was it a child's depiction of being moved? The drought, which had revealed the vault, continued its relentless grip on Lake Holloway. As more of the lakebed became exposed, search teams began a meticulous grid search of the area radiating outwards from the vault's location. Days turned into a week, the sun beating down mercilessly. They found old fishing lures, sunken debris, a lot of mud, and then, about 50 yards from where the vault lay, half buried in the hardened clay, a small metallic object glinted. It was a belt buckle, rusted but intricate. It depicted a soaring eagle. Detective Harding recognized it instantly. Among the items cataloged from the vault was a photograph, tucked inside one of Louise Wright's books. It was a family picture, taken perhaps a year before they disappeared. Arthur Wright was wearing that exact belt buckle. It was his. Why was it here, 50 yards from the vault? Had it fallen off during a struggle, or had he been outside the vault at some point? The discovery spurred the searchers on. They focused on this new area, and then they found more. Small fragments of rotted fabric, different from the scraps caught in the vault door. These were darker, heavier, and then a child's shoe, impossibly small, preserved by the dense mud. It was a little boy's sneaker, Marcus's size. It lay on its side, as if it had simply slipped off a foot. There were no bones, not yet, but the implication was clear. Something had happened outside the vault. The team worked with almost feverish intensity, sifting through the earth. A forensic anthropologist was called in. She confirmed their worst fears. Tiny fragments of bone, almost indistinguishable from the pebbles and dried earth, began to appear. Not enough for a full picture, but enough to say they were human. And then another, more definitive find. A few teeth, scattered, but clearly human. Dental records would be needed, but Brody had a sickening certainty. They had found the Wrights. Or at least, where their long journey had ended. Not in the vault, but here, in the cold mud of the lakebed, exposed after 35 years. Had Henderson moved them here after they died in the vault? Or had he brought them out, one by one, for some final, terrible act? The lack of complete remains suggested dismemberment or animal scavenging over the decades. A gruesome thought. But one thing was clear. The vault was not their grave. It was their prison. This patch of drying earth, 50 yards away, was where their bodies had come to rest. Watched over, perhaps, by their captor, until the lake rose and hid his terrible secret. The decision to approach Thomas Henderson was made quickly. Sheriff Brody, along with Detective Harding, flew to the state where Henderson resided. They found him in a small, neat room in a well-kept retirement facility. He was a shrunken figure in a wheelchair, his skin like old parchment, his eyes pale and cloudy. But when Brody introduced himself and mentioned Lake Holloway, a flicker of something sharp, almost cunning, passed through those eyes. He initially denied everything, claimed he barely remembered the Wright family, said he'd left town because of his asthma. His voice was weak, reedy, but there was an underlying current of something else, not fear, but a strange, unsettling calmness. Brody laid out the evidence, piece by piece. The vault. The construction company records. His knowledge of the lake. The journal. Louise Wright's handwriting. The mention of his name. Henderson listened, his face impassive. He didn't flinch, didn't react, until Brody mentioned the fabric scraps, Rosie's floral dress, Marcus's jeans, caught in the vault door. For a fleeting second, Henderson's composure wavered. His lip trembled. They were a good family, Henderson finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Arthur, he was always fair. Louise, she had a kind smile. It wasn't a confession. Not yet. Harding then produced the photographs of the items found inside the vault. The teddy bear, the toy truck, the drawings. He spoke of the children, of Marcus trying to be brave, of Rosie coughing in the dampness. He described Arthur lifting his dying daughter to the vent to see the imaginary stars. Henderson closed his eyes. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his wrinkled cheek. The lake, Brody pressed gently. Why the lake, Thomas? Why the vault? Henderson was silent for a long time. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of an air purifier. Then he began to speak, his voice a low, rambling monotone, as if recounting a dream or a story someone else had told him. He said he'd been worried about the Wrights. He'd heard things, whispers about Arthur's debts being more serious than anyone knew. He said he feared for their safety, that someone might harm them. He built the vault, he said, or rather, adapted the stolen container as a refuge, a safe place. I wanted to protect them, Henderson said, his voice gaining a strange, fervent intensity. The world outside, it was becoming too dangerous for a family like theirs. I convinced Arthur, told him there was a threat, a serious one, that they needed to hide just for a little while until I could sort things out. He claimed he brought them food, water. He said he checked on them. He painted himself as their reluctant savior, their guardian. But his story was full of holes, contradictions. Why the secrecy? Why the chains? Why the dwindling supplies? Why the terror in Louise's journal? Brody asked about the children. About Rosie. Henderson's face crumpled. She was delicate, he mumbled. The dampness. It wasn't good for her. He admitted she had died in the vault. And Clara, too, not long after. From pneumonia. Then Marcus, from despair and starvation, he implied. He claimed Arthur, in his grief, had become unresponsive, and then he too had faded away. He insisted he hadn't killed them, not directly. He had merely failed to save them from the dangers he himself had manufactured, or from the harsh conditions of the prison he had built. It was a monstrous, self-serving delusion. He spoke of their final days, of moving their bodies from the vault under the cover of darkness. I couldn't leave them in there, he whispered. It wasn't right. I buried them, near the water, so they could be near the lake they loved. It was a twisted, saccharine justification for an act of unimaginable cruelty. He had watched them die, slowly, horribly, and then disposed of their remains, all under the guise of protection. The truth, when it finally came, was more pathetic, more chillingly mundane in its evil than any grand, diabolical plot. It was the story of a lonely, disturbed man, obsessed with a family, who had played God, and in doing so, had become their destroyer. The confession, rambling and self-serving as it was, provided a horrifying narrative. Thomas Henderson hadn't set out to be a monster, or so he claimed. In his twisted mind, he was a protector. He'd admired the Wrights from afar, Arthur's steadiness, Louise's gentle nature, the children's innocent vibrancy. He saw them as an ideal, a symbol of something good he could never possess. When he overheard talk of Arthur's minor financial troubles, his mind warped it into a grave threat, a danger only he could shield them from. The stolen construction vault became his instrument. He'd worked for weeks, perhaps months, preparing it, stocking it with what he thought were adequate supplies, never truly grasping the horror of what he was creating. He lured Arthur to the isolated spot with a fabricated story of needing help. Then, with some pretext, a sudden storm, an imminent danger, convinced or coerced the entire family into the vault, promising it was temporary, for their own good. He was their jailer, doling out hope and sustenance in carefully measured, diminishing doses. The journal told the truth he tried to obscure. Louise Wright's entries chronicled their descent from bewildered trust to dawning terror, then to agonizing, slow despair. The danger outside Henderson spoke of was a phantom, a lie to maintain control. As their health failed, as the children sickened, Henderson's visits became less frequent. Perhaps the reality of what he was doing began to penetrate even his distorted perception, or perhaps he simply grew tired of his cruel game. Rosie died first, her small body succumbing to the cold, damp, airless conditions. Then Clara. Marcus, the brave older brother, held on longer, his small, defiant entries in the journal a testament to his spirit, before he, too, weakened. Arthur, broken by the loss of his children and the betrayal of their captor, faded into silence and then death. Louise was the last. Her final, almost illegible scrawls spoke of an unbearable loneliness, a crushing weight of grief. She likely died within days of her last coherent entry, her strength finally exhausted. Henderson admitted, in disjointed phrases, to finding them one by one. He spoke of dragging their bodies from the vault in the dead of night, using a small handcart, and burying them shallowly in the soft earth nearer the water's edge, where the belt buckle and shoe were eventually found. He chose the spot, he said, because it was peaceful. He even planted wildflowers there the following spring, a grotesque parody of remembrance. The legal proceedings against Thomas Henderson were complex due to his age, his failing health, and the decades that had passed. He was charged, but it was clear he would likely die before ever facing a full trial or serving any significant time in prison. For the community, for any distant relatives of the Wrights who were found, the partial confession was a bitter pill. They knew what had happened and who was responsible, but true justice felt elusive, stolen by time and the strange, pitiable evil of one lonely man. The vault, once emptied of its tragic contents, became a focal point of grief and remembrance. There was talk of preserving it, of creating a memorial. The items found within, the worn teddy bear, the chipped toy truck, Louise's journal, were treated with a near-sacred reverence. They were the last tangible pieces of a family erased too soon. The drought eventually broke. The rains returned, slowly at first, then with more conviction. Lake Holloway began to refill. The waters crept back over the exposed mud flats, inch by inch, reclaiming the land, covering the spot where the vault had been found, and the nearby patch of earth that had served as the Wright family's unhallowed grave. The secret was out, the story told, but the lake, in its impassive way, was taking back its dead. The ending was not clean, not happy. It was a tapestry woven with threads of unimaginable suffering, belated truth, and the enduring ache of loss. The Wright family had been found, their voices heard after 35 years of silence, but their lives remained stolen, their potential unfulfilled. Thomas Henderson would die in a secure medical facility a few months later, taking any further unarticulated secrets or true remorse to his grave. For Sheriff Brody and Detective Harding, the case left an indelible mark. They had unearthed a dark chapter of their county's history, given names to the ghosts. There was a grim satisfaction in that, a sense of duty done, but also a profound sadness for the years lost, the lives destroyed by one man's delusion. The community, too, was changed. The story of the Wright family was no longer a vague local legend. It was a visceral, painful truth. It served as a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist beneath the most ordinary surfaces in the quietest corners of the world. The image of Arthur Wright lifting his dying daughter to a tiny crack in a steel wall, inventing stars for her in the suffocating blackness, would haunt them for years. It was a testament to a father's love in the face of absolute horror, a tiny pinprick of light in an overwhelming darkness. The lake continued to rise, its surface smoothing out, reflecting the sky, as if nothing had ever disturbed its depths. But everyone knew what lay beneath. They knew the story of the family in the vault, a story that would now be told not in whispers of mystery, but in quiet tones of sorrow and remembrance. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.